I am witnessing what may constitute the most comprehensive destruction of democratic institutions in the Western Hemisphere since the rise of military dictatorships in the 1970s, as Nicolás Maduro's systematic dismantling of Venezuelan democracy creates precedents for authoritarian consolidation that extend far beyond Venezuela's borders into a broader assault on democratic governance throughout Latin America, while serving as a testing ground for Russian and Chinese strategies to undermine democratic institutions globally. As I analyze the methodical destruction of electoral integrity, the systematic persecution of political opposition, and the coordinated international support that enables Venezuelan authoritarianism to persist despite overwhelming evidence of illegitimacy, I recognize that Venezuela represents not merely a regional crisis, but a critical battleground in the global struggle between democratic governance and authoritarian expansion that will determine whether democratic institutions can survive sustained assault by determined autocrats backed by hostile foreign powers. The 2024 Venezuelan presidential election represents a textbook case of electoral authoritarianism, where the facade of democratic process conceals systematic manipulation designed to ensure predetermined outcomes while maintaining international legitimacy through procedural compliance that obscures fundamental violations of democratic competition. Maduro's control over the National Electoral Council, systematic exclusion of opposition candidates, manipulation of voter registration systems, and comprehensive media restrictions created conditions where genuine electoral competition became impossible, while international observers faced limited access and systematic obstruction that prevented comprehensive assessment of electoral integrity. The gap between exit polls showing overwhelming opposition victory and official results declaring Maduro's triumph reveals manipulation so extensive that it demonstrates complete abandonment of democratic legitimacy in favor of maintaining power through fraud backed by state coercion. What makes the Venezuelan crisis particularly instructive for understanding global democratic threats is the systematic nature of institutional capture that Maduro implemented through legal and pseudo-legal mechanisms that maintain constitutional appearances while eliminating democratic substance. The Supreme Court's rubber stamp approval of electoral manipulation, the Attorney General's selective prosecution of political opponents, and the systematic use of state resources for partisan political advantage demonstrate techniques for democratic destruction that operate within existing institutional frameworks while fundamentally altering their democratic character. These methods provide templates that other aspiring autocrats, including within established democracies, could adapt for their own institutional capture strategies while maintaining claims to democratic legitimacy. The international dimensions of Venezuelan authoritarianism reveal how great power competition enables regional democratic breakdown when authoritarian states provide systematic support for allied autocrats, while democratic nations prove unable or unwilling to coordinate effective responses to prevent democratic collapse. Russia's military advisors, intelligence cooperation, and energy sector support provide Maduro with technical capabilities and economic lifelines that enable regime survival despite popular opposition and international sanctions, while China's economic investments and diplomatic protection create alternative international relationships that reduce dependence on democratic nations and international institutions committed to democratic governance. This authoritarian axis demonstrates how global autocratic cooperation can neutralize traditional democratic pressure mechanisms while providing autocrats with survival strategies that operate independently of domestic legitimacy. The humanitarian catastrophe resulting from Venezuelan authoritarianism extends beyond immediate human rights violations into systematic economic destruction that has created the largest refugee crisis in Latin American history while destabilizing democratic governance throughout the region. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled their country due to economic collapse, political persecution, and systematic violation of basic rights, creating refugee pressures that strain democratic institutions in neighboring countries while providing Maduro's regime with reduced domestic opposition through forced emigration of potential dissidents. The regional spillover effects include increased criminal activity, human trafficking networks, drug trafficking expansion, and economic disruption that affects democratic stability in Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, and other nations attempting to manage Venezuelan refugee flows while maintaining their own democratic governance. Congressional oversight of American Venezuela policy reveals systematic coordination failures between different government agencies and inconsistent strategic approaches that enable Venezuelan authoritarianism to persist while American policy objectives remain unclear and ineffective. Intelligence assessments indicating Maduro's illegitimacy conflict with diplomatic approaches that maintain formal recognition protocols, while economic sanctions designed to pressure regime change operate without clear success metrics or exit strategies that could guide policy adjustment based on effectiveness assessment. The lack of comprehensive strategy coordination means that American Venezuela policy operates through contradictory approaches that reduce effectiveness while providing Maduro's regime with opportunities to exploit American policy inconsistencies for propaganda and diplomatic advantage. The role of María Corina Machado as opposition leader demonstrates both the potential for democratic resistance and the systematic repression mechanisms that authoritarian regimes deploy to eliminate political competition while maintaining claims to legal legitimacy. Machado's exclusion from electoral participation through pseudo-legal mechanisms, the systematic harassment of her supporters, and the criminalization of peaceful political opposition reveal how authoritarians use state power to eliminate democratic competition while claiming constitutional authority for anti-democratic actions. Her continued resistance, despite personal risk, provides inspiration for democratic movements while exposing the brutal reality of authoritarian repression that operates through legal systems corrupted to serve partisan political objectives rather than constitutional governance. The economic dimensions of Venezuelan collapse reveal how authoritarian mismanagement creates conditions that justify continued authoritarian rule through crisis management rhetoric, while the actual causes of economic destruction remain the authoritarian policies that created the crisis initially. Hyperinflation, currency collapse, infrastructure breakdown, and systematic corruption have reduced Venezuela from one of Latin America's wealthiest nations to a failed state where basic services no longer function reliably. Yet Maduro's regime portrays these failures as justification for emergency powers and continued authoritarian control rather than evidence of authoritarian incompetence. The manipulation of economic crisis for political advantage demonstrates how autocrats can benefit from the disasters their policies create while avoiding accountability for policy failures through scapegoating and emergency justification rhetoric. The oil diplomacy aspects reveal how natural resource wealth can sustain authoritarian regimes despite popular opposition when international actors prioritize economic interests over democratic principles and human rights commitments. Venezuelan oil reserves provide Maduro's regime with revenue streams and diplomatic leverage that enable regime survival despite international sanctions, while countries dependent on Venezuelan energy supplies face conflicts between economic interests and democratic values that often resolve in favor of continued engagement with authoritarian rulers. The pattern demonstrates how resource-curse dynamics enable authoritarian consolidation while creating international stakeholders with economic incentives to maintain relationships with illegitimate governments regardless of their human rights violations and democratic deficits. The information warfare dimensions become apparent when examining how Maduro's regime coordinates with Russian and Chinese information operations to undermine international criticism while promoting alternative narratives about Venezuelan governance that portray authoritarianism as legitimate resistance to American imperialism. state-controlled media, social media manipulation, and systematic disinformation campaigns operate across multiple languages and platforms to shape international opinion while suppressing domestic dissent through information control and propaganda techniques refined through cooperation with Russian and Chinese information warfare specialists. This international information coordination demonstrates how authoritarian regimes share techniques and resources for narrative control, while democratic nations struggle to coordinate effective counter-narratives that expose authoritarian illegitimacy without appearing to engage in similar propaganda tactics. The precedent implications for American democracy become clear when examining how Venezuelan institutional capture techniques could be adapted for use within American political systems by actors seeking to undermine democratic governance while maintaining constitutional appearances. The systematic use of legal mechanisms to exclude political opponents, the weaponization of state agencies for partisan advantage, the manipulation of electoral systems to ensure predetermined outcomes, and the use of crisis rhetoric to justify emergency powers all represent techniques that could be applied within American institutional frameworks by actors willing to prioritize power retention over democratic legitimacy. The Venezuelan example demonstrates how democratic institutions prove vulnerable to systematic assault by actors operating within legal frameworks while fundamentally violating democratic principles. The regional security implications extend beyond refugee flows into broader challenges to democratic governance throughout Latin America, as Venezuelan authoritarianism provides inspiration and technical assistance to other potential autocrats while demonstrating that democratic breakdown can occur without effective international response. The normalization of electoral fraud, political persecution, and authoritarian consolidation in Venezuela reduces international pressure for democratic governance while providing precedents that other aspiring autocrats can cite as justification for their own anti-democratic actions. The failure to prevent Venezuelan democratic collapse sends signals to potential authoritarians throughout the region that democratic breakdown will not trigger effective international intervention or sustained commitment to democratic restoration. The Trump administration implications require analysis of how American Venezuela policy could change based on different priorities regarding authoritarian governance, immigration policy, and international engagement that could either strengthen or weaken pressure for Venezuelan democratic restoration. Previous Trump administration approaches to Venezuela included both maximum pressure campaigns and direct diplomatic engagement with Maduro's regime, while immigration policies that reduce refugee protection could eliminate one source of pressure for Venezuelan political change while increasing humanitarian crisis severity. The unpredictability of American Venezuela policy under changing administrations reduces international coordination effectiveness while providing authoritarian regimes with opportunities to exploit policy transitions for diplomatic and strategic advantage. The counterintelligence dimensions reveal how Venezuelan authoritarianism serves Russian and Chinese intelligence objectives through systematic intelligence sharing, operational coordination, and strategic positioning that extends Russian and Chinese influence throughout Latin America while reducing American intelligence access and operational capability in the region. Venezuelan territory provides Russian and Chinese intelligence services with operational bases, signals intelligence capabilities, and human intelligence assets that support broader intelligence operations targeting American interests throughout the Western Hemisphere. The intelligence cooperation between Venezuela, Russia, and China creates systematic intelligence threats to American national security while demonstrating how regional authoritarian allies can serve broader strategic objectives for hostile great powers seeking to undermine American influence and democratic governance globally. The international law implications become apparent when examining how Venezuelan authoritarianism operates through systematic violation of international human rights commitments, refugee protection obligations, and democratic governance standards, while international legal mechanisms prove inadequate for addressing comprehensive authoritarian consolidation that operates through pseudo-legal domestic processes. The International Criminal Court investigation into Venezuelan human rights violations proceeds through legal processes that operate independently of political timelines, while Maduro's regime continues systematic repression and democratic destruction without effective international legal constraint. The gap between international legal standards and enforcement capabilities demonstrates fundamental weaknesses in international legal frameworks for protecting democratic governance and human rights against determined authoritarian regimes backed by hostile great powers. As I conclude this analysis, I recognize that Venezuela represents more than a regional crisis. It represents a test case for whether democratic nations can effectively defend democratic governance against systematic authoritarian assault backed by hostile great powers willing to provide comprehensive support for allied autocrats. The techniques being perfected in Venezuela for democratic destruction, international legitimacy manipulation, and authoritarian consolidation serve as templates that could be applied in other democratic societies facing similar authoritarian pressures, while the international community's ineffective response to Venezuelan democratic collapse demonstrates dangerous precedents for authoritarian expansion globally. The decisions made about Venezuelan policy will determine whether democratic nations can develop effective responses to comprehensive authoritarian challenges, or whether authoritarian techniques for democratic destruction will continue spreading throughout regions previously considered secure for democratic governance.